Marcus Rodriguez had always been the type of person who noticed things others missed. Working as a maintenance supervisor at Riverside General Hospital in downtown Cleveland, he developed an eye for patterns, anomalies, and the subtle signs that something wasn't quite right. It was this attention to detail that first alerted him to the strange occurrences happening in the emergency ward during the third week of October. The first incident involved a homeless man named Billy Thompson who'd been brought in after collapsing near the riverfront. Dr. Patricia Winters, the head of emergency medicine, had dismissed Marcus's concerns when he mentioned the patient's unusual behavior. Billy had been pronounced dead from what appeared to be a severe infection, but Marcus had seen him moving on the gurney 20 minutes after the time of death was called. When he'd approached Dr. Winters about it, she'd given him a condescending look and suggested he might need to cut back on his overtime hours. "Rodriguez, you're seeing things that aren't there," she'd said, her voice dripping with the kind of authority that people like her wielded over people like him. "Dead bodies sometimes have muscle spasms. It's perfectly normal. Maybe you should focus on fixing the broken air conditioning in room 302 instead of playing medical examiner." But Marcus knew what he'd seen. Billy Thompson had sat up on that gurney, his milky eyes scanning the room with a hunger that made Marcus's skin crawl. The security footage from that night had mysteriously disappeared, and when Marcus tried to access it through his maintenance credentials, he found his access had been revoked without explanation. The second incident happened 3 days later. A woman named Jennifer Walsh, a soccer mom from the suburbs, had been brought in after a car accident. She died from internal bleeding, but Marcus had been in the morgue fixing a faulty refrigeration unit when he heard scratching sounds coming from inside the storage drawers. When he'd opened drawer 17, Jennifer Walsh had lunged at him with superhuman strength, her fingernails elongated into claw-like appendages and her teeth sharp as razors. Marcus had barely escaped, slamming the drawer shut and running to find Dr. Winters. This time she hadn't just dismissed him, she'd threatened his job. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm beginning to question your mental stability. Perhaps you need to take some time off, unpaid of course, to get your head examined. Dead people don't come back to life, and if you continue spreading these ridiculous stories, I'll have no choice but to recommend your termination." The threat had been clear. Dr. Winters held all the power in this situation, and Marcus was just a working-class man trying to support his family. His wife Elena worked double shifts at a nursing home, and their teenage daughter Sophia was counting on them to help pay for college. He couldn't afford to lose this job, but he also couldn't ignore what he was witnessing. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus began documenting everything he observed. He used his maintenance access to move through the hospital unnoticed, taking pictures with his phone and keeping detailed notes in a small notebook he carried in his tool belt. The pattern became increasingly clear. Patients who died from mysterious infections or accidents weren't staying dead. They were transforming into something else, something hungry and violent. The hospital administration, led by Dr. Winters and Chief Administrator Robert Hayes, seemed to be covering up these incidents. Bodies were being moved to a restricted section of the morgue that Marcus didn't have access to, and families were being told their loved ones had been cremated immediately due to infectious disease protocols. When grieving relatives asked questions, they were met with legal threats and intimidation tactics. Marcus tried reaching out to local media, but his calls weren't returned. He attempted to contact the CDC, but was told his concerns would be looked into, and then heard nothing back. It became clear that whatever was happening at Riverside General was being protected by people with far more influence and resources than a hospital maintenance worker could hope to challenge. The breaking point came on Halloween night. Marcus was working late, replacing fluorescent bulbs in the basement corridor, when he heard screaming from the restricted morgue section. Using his master key, he entered the area and discovered the horrifying truth. Dozens of reanimated corpses were being held in reinforced containment units, and Dr. Winters was conducting experiments on them with a team of researchers he'd never seen before. "You shouldn't be here, Rodriguez," Dr. Winters said when she spotted him. Her voice was cold and calculating. "But since you are, perhaps you'd like to volunteer for our research program. We could use a live subject to test the transmission vectors." Marcus ran, knowing that his life and the lives of everyone in Cleveland were now in immediate danger. The people in power had not only allowed this nightmare to begin, but they were actively nurturing it for their own twisted purposes. Marcus burst through the hospital's emergency exit, his heart pounding as he fumbled for his phone. His hands shook as he tried calling Elena, but the call went straight to voicemail. The empty parking lot stretched before him like a concrete wasteland, illuminated only by flickering streetlights that cast eerie shadows across the abandoned cars. He'd never felt more alone or more desperate in his entire life. His first instinct was to drive straight home, but something stopped him. If Dr. Winters and her team were willing to threaten him inside the hospital, they wouldn't hesitate to track him down at his house. His family would be in danger, and he needed proof of what he'd witnessed before anyone would believe him. The notebook in his pocket and the photos on his phone were his only weapons against an enemy with unlimited resources and institutional power. Instead of heading home, Marcus drove to his brother-in-law's auto repair shop on the east side of town. Danny Kowalski had always been the type of guy who asked few questions and offered help when family needed it. More importantly, he had security cameras throughout his shop and enough tools to turn the place into a fortress if necessary. Marcus parked behind the building and used the spare key Danny had given him years ago. The shop smelled of motor oil and old coffee, familiar scents that provided a small measure of comfort in his current nightmare. Marcus found Danny's computer and began uploading the photos he'd taken, creating multiple backup copies on different drives. He printed out pages from his notebook, photocopying everything twice. If something happened to him, he wanted evidence to survive. At 3 a.m, his phone finally rang. Elena's name appeared on the screen and he answered with desperate relief. "Thank God you're okay," he whispered. "Marcus, where are you?" "There are men outside our house. They've been sitting in a black sedan for the past 2 hours, and Sophia is scared. She tried calling you earlier, but your phone kept going to voicemail." Elena's voice carried the controlled panic of someone trying to stay strong for their child. "Listen to me carefully," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Pack a bag for you and Sophia right now. Take only essentials and whatever cash we have in the house. Don't turn on any lights and stay away from the windows. I'm coming to get you, but we can't stay there anymore." "Marcus, you're scaring me. What's going on?" He closed his eyes, knowing that once he told her the truth, their lives would never be the same. "Elena, I discovered something at the hospital. Something that powerful people want to keep secret, and they're willing to hurt our family to protect it. I can't explain everything over the phone, but we need to leave Cleveland tonight." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment Marcus thought the call had dropped. Then Elena spoke, her voice filled with the quiet strength that had made him fall in love with her 20 years ago. "Okay, we'll be ready. But Marcus, promise me you're not doing anything stupid. Promise me you're thinking about Sophia's future." "Everything I'm doing is for Sophia's future," he replied. "For everyone's future." Marcus spent the next hour creating a detailed account of everything he'd witnessed at Riverside General. He wrote about Dr. Winters' dismissive attitude, the missing security footage, the covered-up deaths, and the horrifying experiments in the restricted morgue. He included timestamps, names, and every detail he could remember. He sealed copies in multiple envelopes and hid them throughout Danny's shop, then sent digital copies to his personal email account and 3 others he created on the spot. The drive back to his house took him through neighborhoods he'd known his entire life. Cleveland had always been a working-class city, full of people who minded their own business and took care of their families. Now he was asking himself how many of those families would survive what was coming. How many of his neighbors would become victims of the conspiracy he'd uncovered? As he approached his street, Marcus saw the black sedan Elena had mentioned. 2 men in dark suits sat inside, their attention focused on his house. He parked 3 blocks away and approached on foot, using backyards and alleyways he'd known since childhood. The men in the sedan were clearly professionals, but they weren't from Cleveland. They didn't know the neighborhood's hidden paths and shortcuts. Marcus reached his backyard through the Hendersons' property next door. Elena had left the back door unlocked as planned, and he slipped inside to find his wife and daughter waiting in the kitchen with packed bags. Sophia looked terrified but determined, while Elena had the focused expression she wore during crisis situations at the nursing home. "Dad, what's happening?" Sophia whispered as they prepared to leave through the back door. Marcus looked at his 17-year-old daughter, seeing Elena's eyes and his own stubborn determination reflected in her face. "There are some bad people who want to hurt us because I learned something I wasn't supposed to know. But we're going to be okay. We're going to fight back." They escaped through the Hendersons' backyard, moving silently through the shadows while the men in the sedan maintained their vigil at the front of the house. Marcus had borrowed Danny's pickup truck, which he'd parked 6 blocks away near the old elementary school. As they drove out of Cleveland in the pre-dawn darkness, Elena finally asked the question he'd been dreading. "Marcus, what exactly did you discover at the hospital?" The highway stretched ahead of them, empty except for the occasional trucker making early morning deliveries. Marcus chose his words carefully, knowing that what he was about to tell his family would sound like the plot of a horror movie. "People are dying at the hospital, but they're not staying dead. They're coming back as something else, something dangerous. And the doctors, the administrators, they're not trying to stop it. They're studying it, using it for some kind of research. Sophia laughed nervously from the back seat. Dad, that sounds like zombie movies. Dead people don't come back to life. I wish you were right, sweetheart. But I saw them with my own eyes. I have photos and documentation, and that's why those men were watching our house. The people responsible for this have money and power, and they're willing to destroy anyone who threatens to expose them. Elena reached over and took his hand. What do we do now? Marcus had been thinking about that question since he'd left the hospital. The local authorities couldn't be trusted. If Dr. Winters had enough influence to cover up deaths and make security footage disappear, she probably had connections in the police department and city government. The federal agencies hadn't responded to his earlier attempts at contact, which suggested they were either overwhelmed, compromised, or deliberately ignoring the situation. We're going to Danny's cabin upstate, Marcus said. It's isolated, has its own power generator, and enough supplies to last us several weeks. While we're there, I'm going to figure out how to get this information to people who can actually do something about it. The cabin was located in the Allegheny National Forest, 3 hours north of Cleveland. Danny had bought the property 5 years ago as a hunting retreat, but he'd gradually turned it into a fully equipped survival shelter after becoming convinced that economic collapse was inevitable. Marcus had always thought his brother-in-law was paranoid, but now he was grateful for Danny's preparations. They arrived at the cabin just as the sun was rising through the forest canopy. The two-bedroom structure was smaller than their house in Cleveland, but it was well-built and strategically positioned on high ground with clear sight lines in all directions. Danny had installed solar panels, a wind turbine, and a backup generator. The basement was stocked with enough food, water, and medical supplies to sustain a family for months. Elena and Sophia explored their temporary home while Marcus set up a communication center using Danny's ham radio equipment and satellite internet connection. His first priority was contacting other hospital workers who might have witnessed similar incidents. His second priority was reaching journalists, scientists, or government officials who weren't part of the conspiracy. Over the next 3 days, Marcus made dozens of calls and sent hundreds of emails. Most went unanswered, but he gradually began connecting with people who had observed similar phenomena in other cities. A nurse in Detroit reported patients coming back to life after being pronounced dead. A morgue attendant in Baltimore described having to restrain corpses that had begun moving. A medical examiner in Phoenix claimed his superiors had threatened his career when he tried to report unusual post-mortem activity. The pattern was clear. Whatever was happening in Cleveland was also happening elsewhere, and it was being systematically covered up by people in positions of authority. Marcus began to understand that he wasn't dealing with an isolated incident at one hospital, but with a nationwide conspiracy involving multiple institutions and agencies. On the 4th day, Danny arrived at the cabin with disturbing news from Cleveland. The city had been placed under quarantine after what officials were calling a chemical spill at an industrial facility near the river. Military checkpoints had been established on all major roads, and residents were being told to shelter in place until further notice. The official story was that toxic fumes might cause respiratory problems, but Danny had spoken to friends who reported seeing people attacking each other in the streets. It's starting, Marcus told his family that evening as they sat around the cabin's fireplace. Whatever they were doing at the hospital, they've lost control of it. Elena looked at him with a mixture of fear and determination. So what do? We can't hide up here forever. Marcus had been wrestling with that question since Danny's arrival. They could remain at the cabin and hope the crisis would resolve itself, but that felt like abandoning the innocent people who were suffering because of the conspiracy he'd uncovered. Alternatively, they could try to make their way to Washington, D.C. or another major city where he might find journalists or officials willing to listen to his story. I think we need to try reaching the media in Pittsburgh, he said finally. It's close enough that we can drive there in a few hours, but far enough from Cleveland that the people involved in the cover-up might not have the same influence. If I can get someone to publish the evidence I've collected, it might force a real investigation. The drive to Pittsburgh should have taken 4 hours, but roadblocks and military checkpoints turned it into an 8-hour nightmare. At each checkpoint, soldiers examined their identification and asked detailed questions about their destination and purpose. Marcus told them they were visiting Elena's sister, a lie that required Elena to provide supporting details about a fictional relative. The soldiers seemed tense and distracted, frequently speaking into their radios using codes Marcus didn't recognize. As they approached Pittsburgh, they began seeing evidence of the crisis that official sources weren't reporting. Abandoned cars littered the roadside, some with their doors left open as if the occupants had fled in panic. Military helicopters circled overhead, and smoke rose from several locations within the city limits. The radio played only emergency broadcasts instructing citizens to remain indoors and await further instructions. Marcus had researched investigative journalists in the Pittsburgh area and identified 3 who had previously covered stories involving government corruption and institutional cover-ups. The first, Robert Martinez, worked for the Pittsburgh Tribune and had won awards for exposing environmental violations by major corporations. When Marcus called his office, he was told that Martinez hadn't been seen in 3 days and wasn't responding to calls or emails. The second journalist, Margaret Thompson, freelanced for several national publications and had a reputation for taking on powerful interests. Her apartment building was surrounded by police cars, and neighbors told Marcus that she'd been arrested 2 days ago on charges that seemed completely fabricated. Nobody knew where she was being held or when she might be released. The third journalist, David Park, worked for an alternative weekly newspaper that focused on local politics and social justice issues. Marcus found him at his newspaper's office, but Park was packing boxes and preparing to leave the city. "Whatever story you're trying to tell, I can't help you," Park said when Marcus approached him. 3 journalists in this city have disappeared or been arrested in the past week, all of them people who were working on stories that somebody didn't want published. "I'm getting out of here before I become the 4th. Marcus showed Park the photos and documentation he'd collected, explaining what he'd witnessed at Riverside General Hospital. Park examined the evidence carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each page. "This is incredible," he said finally. "If what you're saying is true, it explains a lot of what's been happening here. We've had reports of violent incidents throughout the city, but the police and city government have been suppressing information about them. Will you publish the story?" Marcus asked. Park looked at the evidence again, then at Marcus and his family. "I can't. Not here, not now. But I know someone who might be able to help you. There's a professor at Carnegie Mellon University named Dr. James Mitchell. He's a microbiologist who's been studying unusual disease outbreaks, and he's been asking questions that have made certain people very uncomfortable. If anyone can verify what you've discovered and get it to the right people, it's him." Dr. Mitchell's laboratory was located in the university's science building, a modern facility that looked strangely normal amid the chaos surrounding them. Marcus was surprised to find the professor working late in his lab, examining specimens under a microscope. Mitchell was a tall, thin man in his 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. "Mr. Rodriguez," Mitchell said after Marcus introduced himself and explained his situation. "I've been expecting someone like you to contact me. What you've witnessed in Cleveland matches reports I've been receiving from colleagues in other cities. The question is whether you're prepared for what I'm about to tell you." Mitchell led them to a secure conference room where he spread out maps, charts, and photographs that painted a picture far more terrifying than Marcus had imagined. The incidents weren't random or accidental. They were part of a carefully orchestrated plan that had been in development for years. The reanimated corpses weren't just a side effect of some medical experiment gone wrong. They were being created deliberately as part of a biological weapon program. "The people behind this have been testing their methods in hospitals, morgues, and funeral homes across the country," Mitchell explained. "They've been refining the process, studying transmission vectors, and preparing for a controlled release. What happened in Cleveland was supposed to be contained, but something went wrong with their containment protocols." Elena grabbed Marcus's hand as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "How many people are involved in this?" "We're talking about a network that includes government officials, military contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and academic institutions," Mitchell replied. "They have resources and influence that make it nearly impossible to expose them through normal channels. That's why journalists are disappearing and why local authorities are suppressing information about the outbreaks." Sophia had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. "If they're so powerful, how do we stop them?" Mitchell smiled grimly. "We don't stop them through the system because they control the system. We stop them by making it impossible for them to control the narrative. We document everything, we create multiple copies of the evidence, and we distribute it through channels they can't monitor or suppress." Over the next several hours, Mitchell showed them how to use encrypted communication networks, anonymous file-sharing services, and underground media outlets that operated outside the mainstream system. He helped Marcus create a comprehensive dossier that included not just the evidence from Cleveland, but corroborating information from other cities and scientific analysis that proved the reanimated corpses were the result of intentional manipulation. "The key is redundancy," Mitchell explained as they worked. They can silence one person or suppress one story, but they can't silence everyone if we distribute the information widely enough. We need to get this evidence to independent journalists, foreign media outlets, scientific organizations, and civilian networks simultaneously. As dawn approached, they had created a detailed plan for exposing the conspiracy. Mitchell would use his academic connections to share the evidence with colleagues at universities around the world. Marcus would contact the hospital workers he'd identified in other cities, providing them with proof that they weren't alone in what they'd witnessed. Elena and Sophia would help coordinate communication with civilian networks and social media platforms that could spread the information faster than official channels could suppress it. But their planning session was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the building. Through the laboratory windows they could see black SUVs surrounding the science building. Armed men in tactical gear were taking positions around the entrances, and it was clear they had only minutes before the building would be breached. "There's an emergency tunnel that connects this building to the steam system," Mitchell said quickly. "It was built during the Cold War as part of the university's civil defense preparations. It's not on any modern blueprints, and it should allow you to reach the parking garage without being detected." Marcus grabbed the evidence they'd compiled while Elena and Sophia gathered their belongings. Mitchell led them through a concealed door behind a storage cabinet, revealing a narrow tunnel that stretched into darkness. "Follow this tunnel for about 200 yards, then take the first left. That will bring you to a maintenance room in the parking garage. There's a service elevator that will take you to street level." "What about you?" Marcus asked. "I'll stay here and destroy any evidence that could implicate the people who are helping us," Mitchell replied. "They'll probably arrest me, but I won't be able to tell them anything about your plans if I don't know where you're going." As they prepared to enter the tunnel, Mitchell grabbed Marcus's arm. "Remember, this isn't just about exposing the conspiracy anymore. The situation has progressed beyond that point. What they've unleashed is spreading, and it's going to get much worse before it gets better. Your priority now is survival, yours and everyone else's." The tunnel was cramped and dark, filled with pipes and electrical conduits that had been installed decades ago. They could hear footsteps and shouting from the building above them as they made their way through the underground passage. Sophia used her phone's flashlight to illuminate their path, and Elena carried the bag containing their most important evidence. They reached the maintenance room just as they heard the sound of breaking glass from somewhere above them. The service elevator was old and slow, but it eventually delivered them to the parking garage where Danny's pickup truck waited. As they drove away from the university, they could see armed men entering the science building through multiple entrances. "Where do we go now?" Elena asked as they navigated through Pittsburgh's empty streets. Marcus had been thinking about that question since they'd left the laboratory. Mitchell's words echoed in his mind. This wasn't just about exposing the conspiracy anymore. The situation had evolved into something far more dangerous, and their priorities had to shift from investigation to survival. But he also knew that survival would be impossible if the conspiracy continued to spread unchecked. "We need to find other people who are fighting back," he said. Mitchell mentioned civilian networks that are organizing resistance. "If we can connect with them, we might be able to coordinate a response that's more effective than what any of us could accomplish alone." They drove through the dawn-lit streets of Pittsburgh, past abandoned businesses and military checkpoints, searching for signs of the underground resistance that Mitchell had described. Marcus knew that their fight was just beginning, but for the first time since this nightmare had started, he felt like they weren't completely alone. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts as they left the city behind, but Marcus had learned not to trust official sources of information. Instead, he tuned to frequencies that Mitchell had given him, hoping to make contact with other people who were fighting against the conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything they cared about. As they drove toward an uncertain future, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. He'd gone from being a maintenance worker who fixed air conditioning units to being a fugitive carrying evidence that could expose a nationwide conspiracy. The powerful people who had dismissed him and threatened his family had underestimated his determination to protect the people he loved. "Dad," Sophia said from the back seat, "I'm proud of you for not giving up." Marcus smiled, feeling a surge of determination that surprised him with its intensity. "We're not giving up, sweetheart. We're just getting started." 2 weeks later, Marcus stood in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, addressing a group of 43 people who had become the foundation of what they called the Resistance Network. The warehouse had been converted into a communications center and supply depot, with ham radio equipment, computer terminals, and stockpiled food and medical supplies. Maps covered the walls, marked with red pins indicating confirmed outbreak locations and blue pins showing safe zones where survivors had successfully established defensive positions. The people gathered in the warehouse represented a cross-section of American society that the conspiracy's architects had never anticipated would band together. There was Maria Santos, a former Army medic who had witnessed covered-up incidents at a military hospital in Texas. Jake Patterson, a truck driver who had seen roadblocks being established before official quarantine announcements were made. Dr. Lisa Chong, a veterinarian who had noticed unusual behavior in animals near outbreak zones. Beth Williams, a social worker who had lost contact with colleagues in multiple cities simultaneously. Each person had their own story of discovering the truth and being dismissed, threatened, or silenced by authorities. Each had made the difficult decision to abandon their normal lives and join a resistance movement that existed outside the law and beyond the reach of conventional institutions. They had come together through encrypted networks, coded messages, and word-of-mouth communications that couldn't be monitored by the people they were fighting against. The situation reports from this week confirm what we suspected, Marcus said, pointing to a large map of the United States. The outbreaks aren't random and they're not accidental. They're following a specific pattern that suggests coordinated timing and strategic targeting. Major population centers are being affected first, followed by secondary cities that serve as transportation hubs. Maria Santos stepped forward, carrying a folder thick with documentation. My contacts at Fort Bragg confirmed that military units are being deployed not to contain the outbreaks, but to prevent information from spreading. Soldiers who ask too many questions are being reassigned or discharged. Officers who refuse to participate in cover-up operations are being arrested on fabricated charges. The implications of Maria's intelligence were sobering. If the military was compromised, traditional channels of resistance and communication were useless. The resistance network would have to rely entirely on civilian resources and underground networks to coordinate their response to the crisis. Dr. Chang had been analyzing samples collected from various outbreak sites, using equipment they'd salvaged from abandoned laboratories and medical facilities. Her findings confirmed Mitchell's earlier analysis. The reanimated corpses were being created through a deliberately engineered pathogen that could be activated remotely through electromagnetic signals. The conspiracy wasn't just about biological weapons, it was about population control on a massive scale. The good news is that we've identified the transmission mechanism, Chang reported. The bad news is that stopping it requires taking down communications infrastructure that the entire country depends on. We're talking about cell phone towers, radio transmitters, and satellite networks. Destroying those systems would cripple the conspiracy's ability to trigger new outbreaks, but it would also isolate millions of people who are depending on communications to coordinate their own survival efforts. Elena had emerged as the network's coordinator for civilian outreach and family support services. She helped new members adjust to life underground while maintaining communication with relatives who remained in quarantine zones. Her nursing home experience proved invaluable for managing the psychological stress that came with abandoning normal life and accepting the reality of their situation. We've established contact with survivor groups in 18 states, she reported. Most are small, families or neighbors who banded together when official evacuation orders didn't come or didn't make sense. But some are larger, including a group of National Guard soldiers in Colorado who refused orders to suppress information about outbreaks in Denver. Sophia had surprised everyone, including her parents, by demonstrating a natural talent for electronic surveillance and counterintelligence. Working with Jake Patterson and two former telecommunications workers, she had developed methods for monitoring official communications without being detected. Her youth and technical skills made her invaluable for understanding how the conspiracy was using social media and digital platforms to control information. They're not just suppressing news about the outbreaks, Sophia explained, showing the group screenshots of social media posts that had been deleted or modified. They're actively spreading disinformation designed to make people distrust their own observations. If someone posts about seeing unusual behavior or unexplained deaths, automated systems flag those posts and replace them with fact checks that claim the original poster was mistaken or lying. The scope of the digital manipulation was staggering. The conspiracy had infiltrated social media companies, search engines, and news aggregation services, giving them the ability to shape public perception in real time. People who tried to share information about the outbreaks found their accounts suspended or their posts shadow banned so that friends and family members never saw them. Marcus looked around the warehouse at the faces of people who had sacrificed everything to fight an enemy that most Americans didn't even know existed. 2 months ago, he had been a maintenance worker concerned about fixing broken air conditioning units. Now he was leading a resistance movement that represented the last hope for exposing a conspiracy that threatened the survival of human civilization. The irony wasn't lost on him that Dr. Winters and her colleagues had dismissed him as just a working-class man whose concerns weren't worth their attention. They had underestimated the determination and resourcefulness of ordinary people who were willing to fight for their families and communities. The conspiracy's greatest weakness was its assumption that people like Marcus would remain powerless in the face of institutional authority. "We have confirmation that the next phase of their plan involves triggering simultaneous outbreaks in rural areas," Marcus announced. "They've been focusing on cities because population density makes the pathogen more effective, but they need to eliminate rural safe zones before people can organize large-scale resistance. We have maybe 2 weeks before they activate the systems in farming communities and small towns across the Midwest." The room fell silent as people absorbed the implications of this intelligence. Many of the network members had relatives in rural areas, people who had chosen to stay on family farms or in small towns because they believed those locations would be safer than urban areas. If the conspiracy succeeded in triggering rural outbreaks, millions of people would be trapped with nowhere to run. Beth Williams spoke up from the back of the room. "What's our plan? We can't warn everyone because the communication systems are compromised. We can't rely on law enforcement or government agencies because they're either compromised or powerless. How do we protect people who don't even know they're in danger?" Marcus had been preparing for this question, knowing that the network's survival depended on their ability to take decisive action despite overwhelming odds. The plan he was about to propose would require every person in the room to risk everything they had left, but it was the only strategy that offered hope for stopping the conspiracy before it achieved its ultimate goals. "We're going to do something they won't expect," Marcus said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had already lost everything and discovered he was stronger than he'd ever imagined. "We're going to take the fight directly to them. We're going to expose their operations in a way that makes it impossible for them to deny or suppress the truth. And we're going to do it using the one weapon they can't defend against: ordinary people who refuse to be intimidated by power and authority." The faces around the warehouse reflected a mixture of fear, determination, and hope. These were people who had already sacrificed their old lives for the chance to save their country and their families. Now Marcus was asking them to risk the lives they had built in the underground, but he was also offering them something they hadn't had since this nightmare began: a real chance to win. As the meeting continued into the night, plans took shape for coordinated strikes against the conspiracy's infrastructure, simultaneous releases of evidence to media outlets around the world, and the creation of safe zones where ordinary citizens could organize their own defense against the manufactured crisis. The maintenance worker who had once been dismissed as insignificant had become the leader of a movement that would determine whether humanity would survive the greatest threat it had ever faced. The war for truth had begun, and Marcus Rodriguez intended to win it.